1920s literature. The immortal authors F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, Agatha Christie, E.M. Forster, Sinclair Lewis, Edith Wharton, Theodore Dreiser. The great novels of the 1920s, The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises, Ulysses, An American Tragedy, The Sound and the Fury. Not to mention the great poets of the decade, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Langston Hughes. These names and titles conjure up the image of the literary greats of the decade, but that's mostly due to retrospect. Of course, that's not to say that these writers and novels aren't truly great. They are. But like many great works of art, they weren't fully appreciated in their time. For example, The Great Gatsby is now considered to be the quintessential 1920s novel, and is consistently ranked as one of the greatest American novels ever written. But when it was first released, it did not sell well. It sold only 25,000 copies between its publication in 1925 and Fitzgerald's death in 1940. Of course, others in the literary sphere knew of its greatness, but it remained relatively obscure to the general public at the time. The real moneymakers, the real representation of the biggest chunk of the reading public, were pulp magazines. In case you don't know, pulp magazines were collections of usually low-quality short fiction or novelettes printed on low-quality paper. It was essentially literature that was not made to last. They were really only there to make some quick money. The reason you've never heard of most pulp authors or pulp stories is because they really weren't very good. They were strictly ephemeral. Pulp magazines were the successor to dime novels, a trend that was especially popular in the second half of the 19th century. Dime novels had generally depicted exciting action in the new and dangerous western territories of the United States, where the hero would often fight savage Indians or outlaws. They were usually not particularly well written and completely dismissed by literary critics. It was the same for pulp magazines. However, the new modern era took the dime novel formula and adjusted it. The stories were often shorter and featured more aspects of niche genres like crime, horror, and the newly emerging science fiction, as well as the always popular steamy romance. The popular stock character of a beautiful, scantily clad woman was often illustrated on the covers. Some of the more borderline inappropriate pulp magazines were sometimes sold under the counter at certain stores. It may be hard to understand the popularity of pulp magazines in numbers, so let's look at a quick comparison with normal literature at the time. Ernest Hemingway's very popular breakthrough novel, The Sun Also Rises, sold an impressive 19,000 copies within 6 months of its release in 1926. But at the same time, the leading pulp magazine boasted a monthly circulation of nearly 600,000. Other popular pulp magazines had more than 100,000 copies in circulation every month. Some even switched to a bi-weekly schedule. Pulp fiction was written quickly and efficiently, at a rate that no serious novelist could ever hope to compete with. So the main takeaway is that pulp fiction was written for the masses. It was not art. It was not a glimpse into the nature of humanity. It was not a satire or commentary on society. It was pure escapism. Think of the cheesy, poorly made entertainment of any decade, and it will boil down to the same conclusion. While some pulp writers such as H.P. Lovecraft would eventually be critically recognized for their writing, most have faded into oblivion, and few are mourning that loss. Edgar Rice Burroughs, one of the most popular pulp writers of all time, was blunt in his self-evaluations of his own writing and stories. In 1929, he wrote, "I have never taken my work very seriously, and I am afraid that I never shall." He also said that same year, "I knew nothing about the technique of story writing, and now, after 18 years of writing, I still know nothing about the technique." Burroughs' explanation of how he began writing pulp fiction sounds like it could have easily applied to any other amateur writer who wanted to make some quick cash. "I had good reason for thinking I could sell what I wrote. I had gone thoroughly through some of the all-fiction magazines, and I made up my mind that if people were paid for writing such rot as I read, I could write stories just as rotten. Although I had never written a story, I knew absolutely that I could write stories just as entertaining and probably a lot more so than any I chanced to read in those magazines." But that didn't mean that pulp fiction didn't make its mark on the entertainment world. Well-known characters such as Tarzan, Zorro, and Buck Rogers all made appearances in 1920s pulp magazines. And many famous authors got their start writing pulp fiction. The most obvious example is H.P. Lovecraft, whose extremely influential stories had been published almost exclusively in pulp magazines. Probably the most well-known pulp author was Edgar Rice Burroughs, who I mentioned before. He is best known for creating Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. He began publishing pulp fiction in 1915, and by the early 1920s, he had become extremely successful. And there was Dashiell Hammett, who got his start in the late 1920s writing hard-boiled detective stories and would go on to write such famous stories as The Maltese Falcon and The Thin Man in the early years of the next decade. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the magazines themselves. Argosy was probably the most popular pulp magazine of the 20s. It's also regarded as the first real pulp magazine, starting the whole trend at the turn of the century. Originally publishing normal short fiction, it eventually switched to a pulp fiction format and enjoyed amazing success, boasting a circulation of around 500 to 600,000 in the 1920s. Maybe the most iconic pulp magazine was Amazing Stories. Not only did it publish, well, amazing stories that took the reader on adventures to space and lost worlds, each monthly issue also featured a science fiction-influenced cover. The covers were so popular that when the magazine changed to a less in-your-face cover design, sales plummeted, all but forcing the head editor to bring back the original style. These covers would later become very important to the aesthetic of science fiction, particularly in the 1950s. Other popular pulp magazines of the day included The Black Mask, Love Story Magazine, and Weird Tales. There were hundreds of different publications, if not thousands, some lasting no more than a few issues. Most had some kind of theme, usually a specific genre like those I listed before. Pulp magazines, when first created, usually featured reprints of older popular stories such as The Exciting Adventures of Jules Verne and the alien and time travel tales of H.G. Wells. But once pulp fiction, especially in the fledgling science fiction genre, developed an established community of fans, sales really began to take off. While pulp magazines contributed to the rapid development of science fiction as a genre, it also had a slower but equally important influence on crime noir. By the end of the decade, crime pulp writers like Dashiell Hammett were on their way to creating iconic characters like Sam Spade. Outside of real pulp fiction, detectives like Agatha Christie's Detective Poirot, Philip Vance, and the Hardy Boys were enjoying their first successes. So while there were a few notable characters in pulp crime fiction in the 1920s, the way was paved for the explosion in popularity of the genre in the 1930s. In their time, pulp magazines were rarely taken seriously by anyone in any kind of literary circle. There was also the stereotype that pulp fiction was for children, especially young boys. The style was simplistic and easily accessible. Anyone looking for some quick escapism could enjoy an endless amount of stories that would satisfy their craving. The unabashed sensationalism and manly adventure was extremely appealing for boys who wanted to escape their sometimes too comfortable life into a world of exotic fantasy. So, what is the legacy of pulp magazines of the 1920s? There were few notable pulp authors, few notable and original stories, and most of the stories were sensationalist and not very well written, and were disliked by most middle-class adults for being just that. The magazines themselves were made from untrimmed, low-quality paper that was not meant to last. In nearly every sense, they were made to be ephemeral. With all this in mind, it would seem that pulp fiction was just literary trash, and many contemporaries would have agreed. But pulp magazines did make an important contribution to pop culture. It was precisely their over-the-top style that inspired others to use those elements and refine them into a more balanced way of storytelling. The competitiveness of the pulp magazines with each other drove creativity, leading to the further development of many subgenres of literature that we know and love today. And the artwork on the covers of some of the more popular magazines have become iconic symbols, especially among fans of science fiction and crime noir, and heavily influenced the development of the aesthetic of those subgenres. To summarize, pulp magazines were for the masses, and the stories were dependent on what the public wanted. So even more than mainstream literature, pulp fiction really reflected the desires of a large section of the American population, and especially for young boys, was one of the best outlets to experience manly and daring adventures that they couldn't have in peacetime. Even though pulp fiction had a fairly bad reputation in the greater literary sphere, it influenced the pop culture of the following decades in more ways than most would have believed at the time. Pulp magazines were not so different from the other forms of mass entertainment in any time period, past or present. Everyone likes a little adventure, or a guilty pleasure of some kind, and that's what pulp magazines gave them.
Get to bed by 3, be sure to take good care of yourself, you belong to me. Be careful crossing streets, don't eat meat.
I had been planning on covering this subject for a while, because I found it fascinating that such low-quality reading material could have such an impact on pop culture, and really helped to define entire subgenres while they were still in their infancy. Maybe some of the points in this video were a bit repetitive, but I really wanted to stress them. So I hope you found this video interesting, and maybe learned a thing or two about the world of pulp magazines in the 1920s. Well, that's all for now, you cheeks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.